sitting next to you has to pay for. How much am I bid for this $20 bill? Okay, do you understand the point I'm trying to make here? Now, the importance of the point is funny, we're laughing about it, but I can tell you, when you spend $3.5 trillion, which is what we spend average at the federal level every year, this is a big problem. You're spending someone else's money. And that's the point that I wanted to make and to help you understand is that no matter how successful we are in replacing the people we feel are irresponsible in Washington with people that we feel are strict constitutional conservatives, you still have this problem. It goes with the nature of one person. We're on number 2 now. One person, that's the government official, taking money from a second person, that's you and I, and giving it to a third person. What's the problem with that? Well, number one, the first person has no idea how hard the second person had to work to earn that dollar. He has no appreciation for it. Number two, he has no idea what the preferences of the third person are. He may do something like I did one year when I was first married. I bought my wife a purse. I hope you've never made this mistake, men, but if you've been tempted, let me caution you not to do it. No, don't do it. Don't do it. Fight yourself. You'll thank me. Again, that is a problem that can't be solved by politics. It's an economic problem. The result is horribly inefficient, and there's nothing that can be done about it. Let's go to the next one. If you don't spend your money, if you're spending somebody else's money, then you may spend too much of it. In which case you may find that you don't have enough revenue to fully cover all the spending decisions you made, in which case you may have to borrow to cover it. But there is a very important moral principle that goes along with borrowing. And Thomas Jefferson explained this principle in a letter of September 6, 1789 to James Madison, who would become president. Then I say the earth belongs to each of these generations during the course fully and in its own right. The second generation receives it clear of the debts and encumbrances of the first, the third of the second, and so on. No generation can contract debts greater than may be paid during the course of its own existence. The moral principle that Jefferson was talking about here is very simple. It is not possible for us to morally obligate our children. No, certainly not obligate our grandchildren. And yet, since about 1960, we have reached a situation in which the debt that we have is now so large that it cannot be paid off. Up to that point, America borrowed money to fight wars. We borrowed money to buy land, Louisiana Purchase and Alaska and so forth. But whoever was Secretary of the Treasury at that time always established a sinking fund, which is basically just a savings account if you want to think about it that way. And every month, the Secretary of the Treasury would take some of the tax money that flowed in that month and he'd put it in this account. And then when the bonds came due and the bondholders presented their bonds and said, okay, we loaned you the money 20 years ago, here's the bond, I want my money back. He'd go to that savings account and he'd take the money out and he'd pay them off. We don't do that anymore. We don't do that because we can't do it. There is not enough tax revenue to pay off the national debt when it comes due. And that's one of the things that I don't think has been, I know the media is not making that as clear as it should be. Let's go to the next one, Cindy. This is a chart that I think, if I could give a person who did not understand the significance of the national debt, if I could give them just one picture, I think it would be this one. I went back to 1792 and I looked at the debt all the way up to 2013, and here's the picture. And you will notice that up until about 1950, what you have there looks basically like a flat line right along the axis. And then there's a little kick up, that's World War II. And then you'll notice that it just takes off much like a rocket. Okay? Now, if you were to do projections based on that rocket path, what kind of projections would you come up with? Well, I mean, you wouldn't want to consider it, would you? I mean, they're just unimaginable. So when you hear people in positions of authority saying that the most important thing to do is to raise the debt ceiling so we can borrow more money, you have to wonder, what universe do they live in? Where do they think they are? What country do they think they're living in? Now, if you shorten that time period up and start at World War II, which is the next slide, this shows the national debt, what's happened to it since World War II. And you'll notice that, sorry for the graphics there, that's one of those that was translated from a new program into an old program. Doesn't look very good. But anyway, the 1946 level of our national debt, does anybody know how big the debt was in 1946, the end of World War II? It was 125% of our GDP. Right now it's 100. So if that level of debt could be represented by the number 100, then the level of debt that we have now could be represented by the number 6,489. In other words, that's 65 times larger. And so it has really been accelerating. Let's go to the next one. In this particular chart, I asked myself, what if the national debt had increased since World War II to keep up with population and inflation? If it had done that, you'd be looking at the blue line. That shows what our national debt would have done between 1946 and 2013. Well, the part of 2013 we have numbers for. The red line is the actual path of the debt. Now you see that in the early stages there, you see B, area B. It's kind of hard to see B because the lines almost touch there, but for a short period the blue line is actually higher than the red line. But when you look at area A, that's where the red line, the actual, is far above what it would have been just growing for population and inflation. So if you subtracted area B from area A, you'd end up with $12.4 trillion. Or another way of saying that is $12.4 trillion of the 17 is over and above population and inflation growth. And it's simply an indicator that any pretensions at spending restraint have just gone out the window. There just isn't any. Now, 1917 does not appear in this particular chart, but 1917 is kind of an interesting year. That's the first year that Congress imposed a debt ceiling. Prior to that time, Congress had to authorize every single issuance of debt Every one had to be approved by the Congress. And so in 1917, they established this debt ceiling. And if you read about the passage of that act, you will discover the reason they put the debt ceiling in there is to force Congress to have a discussion about spending. That's why they did it. The same reason that sitting around the kitchen table, if you had a spending problem, you might set a ceiling. And then when you got up to that ceiling, you might sit down at the kitchen table and have a discussion about what we could do to make sure we stay below that ceiling. So the debt ceiling was created for a very important purpose. And what we've been doing in the last 4 or 5 years is going around that purpose. We don't want to sit down at the table and have this discussion, so we go around the circle and talk about that. Now, I made the point earlier about Secretary of the Treasury. Let's go to the next one.